All right, so welcome to the devotional today. I'm really happy to be able to talk with you today. I'm really sad that I don't get to be there in person to chat with you, but circumstances have just been such that I can't be there. But what I've done is I've gathered a few friends who are going to help us to talk and think about this. And so while they're talking and thinking about it, I'm hoping that you're talking and thinking about it too. So I've got several friends here. So I've got Emily, who is at Springville High School, and Cash, who's at Springville High. Lizzie is also at Springville High, and Nolan is at Springville Junior High here in Springville, Utah. And they're going to help us out today and talk about these ideas. Okay, so today we're going to talk about reconciling science and religion. So I know a lot of times as we learn about scientific topics, sometimes they seem to conflict with what we've been taught in our religion. And so we want to be able to save our testimonies, to maintain our belief by understanding how science works and how it can fit together with what we're learning in our church classes or in sacrament meeting. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And so let me just introduce myself briefly. So my name is Dr. Jensen, and I am an education researcher in the biology department at BYU. So that means that I'm a biologist, but I study how students learn. Specifically, I focus on the reconciliation of evolution and religion. So helping students overcome some of the barriers they might have to learning evolution. I run a lot of workshops even outside of our religions. So we do workshops with all different religious denominations, talking about how we can reconcile faith and evolution. I belong to the broader social impacts committee of the Human Origins Project at the Smithsonian. So I do a lot of work even nationally surrounding this issue. And then let's see, lastly, I am the mother of 4 boys, and that's my favorite job that I have. Okay, so let's talk about how we reconcile this. So I'm going to start with 2 emails, and I'm going to move this up. I don't know how this is looking on the screen, but we'll move it like that. Okay, so the 2 emails, the first one says, Dr. Jensen, I've been going through a process of serious deconstruction of my Mormon faith. This process began when my very literal and dogmatic Mormon worldview was shattered as I became aware of the overwhelming evidence in support of evolution. This realization that everything I had been taught on this topic was likely wrong led me to question everything to the point that I seriously doubt the very existence of God. And let's contrast this with the one on the right that says, Dear Dr. Jensen, your class helped me to spark a love for science and gain a greater understanding of the complementary nature of science and faith. And it was something I needed to hear today. So let's talk about the difference between those two. What do you guys think? What's going on in these 2 students' lives?
In the first one, it looks like the student is, well, obviously they're having a hard time and they are leaning sort of further towards the science side of things, okay, while leaning on the hand, the other student is very much more, they're able to accept both religion and science together.
Okay, awesome, Cash. Thank you. Anyone else? What's happening here? What do you think?
I think the person on the left seems like they had a doubt, and then they began to gather like all this evidence they possibly could to like support their doubt instead of like first looking at the evidence and making their conclusion based off of faith. It seemed like they were basing their conclusion off of doubt.
Excellent, Lizzie. Thank you. Yeah, so there's certainly some doubt going on in the student in the left, and the student in the right's been able to somehow make these 2 come together. And so that's what we want to figure out today, is what is going on in the minds of these 2 students that's causing this difference. And so I've come up with, let me move you out of the way again. I've come up with 6 things that those who can reconcile the 2 don't do. So we're going to talk about 6 mistakes that we sometimes make as we talk about science and religion. Okay, so first is to use a deficit model. We're going to talk about each of these individually. Second, to approach the conflict through pseudoscience. Third, to misunderstand the nature of science. Fourth, to assume science is atheistic. Fifth, to invoke a God of the gaps. And 6th, to display dogmatism. Okay, so let's talk about each one of those individually. So the first one, using a deficit model on people of faith. So you've probably all heard of Richard Dawkins. He's very famous. He talks a lot against those who have faith. specifically about evolution. And he says evolution is almost universally accepted among those who understand it and almost universally rejected by those who don't. So he's assuming that if you don't accept evolution, it's because you somehow lack knowledge or intelligence, that in other words, if you don't accept science, you're dumb. How many of you have heard that before? Is that a kind of a consensus you've heard?
Yeah, I've heard that. My orchestra teachers use that a lot with songs. If we're unable to play a song, well, if we don't like a song, it means we're unable to play it.
Okay, yeah, you lack some kind of knowledge or understanding or skill. Okay, and that's called a deficit model. So what we're going to do right now is a little exercise. We've actually gathered data on this. I'm going to shrink you guys for a minute. And we've looked at several different things and tried to figure out what the relationship is between them. So let me orient you to this. These are measures of your religiosity. So religious hope is like, do you believe in an afterlife? Do you believe in miracles? Religious practice is, do you go to church? Do you read your scriptures? That kind of thing. And then religious influence, like how much does your religion influence what you wear, what you eat, what you do? So this is your religiosity. And then we looked at how accepting they were of evolution, okay, that organisms evolve. We also looked at how much they believed in these non-scientific sort of creationist ideas, like the earth is less than 10,000 years old, or that humans didn't evolve, things like that. And then we also looked at your scientific reasoning abilities. You can think of this as sort of like a science IQ. And what we wanted to know is, what were the relationships between them? Does scientific reasoning ability somehow affect whether you're religious or not? Or does it affect your acceptance of evolution? Does your belief in non-creationist things, is that dependent upon your religiosity? So I want you to have a discussion with each other for a second and try to figure out, what's the relationship? Is it a positive or negative relationship between these four things? Okay, so you can unmute yourself and just have a little conversation. What do you think? And you in the audience can do the same. Think about, what are the relationships between these?
Well, I feel like
Sorry.
if you, I feel like if you
Go
fully
ahead. Go ahead,
understand.
Nolan, why don't you start?
Okay, sorry. I feel like if you fully understand like both science and religion, you can see how they fit together. So I think it would positively impact.
Okay, if you have good scientific reasoning, you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. Lizzie, did you have a thought?
I don't really know. I think that the more religious you are, you can still have like a good scientific reasoning with being religious. I don't think that being religious means you can't like think logically and all that, you know.
Okay. Good. Yeah, Emily, you were going to say something too.
Sorry, my camera's having problems.
That's
so
okay.
It's being weird. But yeah, I was gonna say, like Lizzie, I think you can be religious and still believe in science. I know that sometimes they contrast each other a lot, but I think religious beliefs kind of play into science.
Okay. And Cash, can I ask you to answer, what do you think Richard Dawkins would say, the guy I quoted before?
I think he'd say that, it can only be scientific. It can't be religious at all. Nothing, like, if everything can be explained in a scientific way.
Yeah, so maybe your scientific reasoning ability would be low if you were religious.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think another thing is, this situation, it isn't like a happy medium. Like, it's not like you can sort of accept religion and sort of accept science at the same time. It's like Nolan said, it's more of like a connection. Like, they'll connect and you can fully understand both of them. So you don't have to really choose one or the other.
Excellent. Okay, well, let me show you what we found. Okay. So looking at these, what we found is, number one, the more religious a person was, and this was a survey done across the country, so not just amongst Latter-day Saints, but across all different religions, the more religious, generally, the more we saw these sort of non-scientific creationist beliefs popping up, and that negatively influenced your acceptance of evolution. So we do see that religiosity in some faiths seems to correlate, and even in our faith seems to correlate with a lower acceptance of evolution. But what we did not find is scientific reasoning ability. It had no effect on whether you're religious, on whether you accept evolution, on whether you accept these non-scientific beliefs. So it's not a smarts thing, right? It doesn't mean if you don't accept science, it doesn't mean that you're dumb. It means that you've got some other inherent conflict that maybe is playing a role. So we shouldn't assume a deficit, but I agree with you guys. There's no reason you can't be really, really smart and be very, very religious, right? And that's what we're seeing here. So good. Okay, so let's look at the second one. The second one is to take this pseudoscience approach to try to avoid the conflict. So I want you to look at these two pictures. One of them comes from the Creation Museum in Petersburg, Kentucky, and the other one is a depiction of the Earth using the universal model. So I want you to look at these pictures and tell each other what's wrong with these pictures.
Well, the first one shows a model of a human living at the same time as what looks like a miniature T-Rex.
Like a velociraptor.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. What else do you see wrong? Anyone else?
The second picture shows the Earth has a water core, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that's not true. We know that it has like lava and magma.
Yeah.
And so that's not true.
Okay. Yeah. So these obviously have problems, but these are theories being taught right now today. And it's kind of this mistaken approach to, you know what, the science is scary. And so what I'm going to do is come up with an alternative model that allows me to maybe interpret Genesis literally, for instance, right? That everything was created at the same time. And so it's a dangerous way to go. And I don't think students necessarily do this, but they're presented with these pseudoscience models as a way to just avoid the conflict. But what happens is, as all of you have shown, you know your science well, right? So when you see models like this, what does it make you think about the people presenting these models?
I'm not sure it would be very appropriate for me to share my view. I mean, it's kind of like baffling, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. Do you want to trust anything else they're telling you? Probably not, right? It's a funny attempt that they're making to try to make science more compatible with faith, but it ends up driving people away from the faith because they think, what in the world? Why are you teaching this when I know it's not true?
It almost makes me like discredit them. It's like, wait, this isn't true, so why would anything else you're gonna say be true? You know, like it discredits them instead of helping their cause.
And I'm glad you said that. It takes us back to that first email of that student who said they saw this depiction of evolution and realized that what they'd been taught maybe wasn't quite scientifically accurate, but it made them question everything else about their religion. And that's unfortunate. And that's something also to keep in mind, is that if you run into something like this where you think, wow, what I was taught was wrong, that doesn't necessarily mean everything about your religion is wrong. It just means that somebody, in a misguided attempt to try to help you understand, taught you something maybe that wasn't quite true. And so we want to avoid the pseudoscience. We want to learn the science, because it turns out the science can be totally compatible with the religion if we learn it correctly. Okay, other thoughts on that? Do we understand the pseudoscience approach and why it's wrong? Okay, let's look at the next one. Oh, actually, let's look at this email because this is important. So I'm gonna move you over here. So this email says, hello, Professor Jensen. I had an interesting experience a couple years ago when I had the opportunity to take your Bio 130 class and take a small religion class at the same time. In your biology class, we talked about evolution and the proof there is for it and how it does not need to disrupt your testimony. In my religion class, my teacher told me that they could not tell us that evolution was wrong, but she could give us information, and we had to read many articles that were very anti-evolution. I came out of the semester believing in evolution. So This is very disturbing to me because this is what's happening, right? We're getting pseudoscience in one class and we're getting regular real science in another class. But what is the problem with what happened to this student? Somebody catch what's wrong? Yeah, catch.
It would affect them very much on a mental level, being almost like taking their two halves of their brain and almost trying to tear them apart. They're trying to think two things at the same time. But it could also affect you on like a more physical, like a grade level, like your GPA, because you might be adding things from one class to another. And if they're both conflicting classes.
Yeah, that might be really hard if they conflict. Yeah, and what happened? What did this student decide was the best explanation?
They decided that evolution was the best, and the problem with that, even though it's true, was that they associated being wrong with the religion class that they took, and so then they might associate other things that they learned in that religion class with being wrong, which might be a problem for their testimony in that religion.
Excellent. That's exactly right. This student was being forced to choose between the two, and it doesn't have to be a choice. And that's often what happens when pseudoscience is presented. Then we're forcing people to choose one over the other. And a lot of times the students choose science. And that's not, I mean, we want them to understand the science, right? But we don't want them to step away from their testimony to do so. And they don't have to, but sometimes in the way that we present it, we make it a false choice. And so we don't want it to be a choice. Excellent. Okay, so let's watch this little video, and I'm going to optimize it for the video. So I'm going to make you guys disappear for just a second. All right, here we go.
To start off, we will observe several students participating in an in-class activity to better understand what a theory is for scientists. All of these students are being presented with a Lego structure made up of a few dozen pieces concealed in an opaque cloth bag. They are instructed to build a structure identical to the one inside of the bag, but they are not allowed to look in the bag. Instead, they are only allowed to reach into the bag and feel what pieces go where. They are also given a large amount of Lego pieces, which not only include all of the pieces they need to build the structure, but several other pieces that are not needed. Now that the students have built the structure they believe to be identical to the mystery structure inside of the bag, they are given time to compare their product with their classmates. Although mostly minor differences, some students used a cylinder while others used a Lego head in a particular spot. Additionally, some students used two smaller blocks instead of one larger one in another spot. Lastly, the colors for all of the bricks are different. How can these students resolve their differences? They need to collaborate and get more data. So, they will discuss their differences and reach back into the bag to come to a consensus. After a bit of fine-tuning, the students have the same structure, for the most part. However, the color conundrum has left some scratching their heads. How can they decide on what color is right? Or is that even possible?
Okay, so let me get you guys back here. All right, so let's talk about this. We're going to go to this structure. So here's their structures. I've set them up here for you. You're looking at 4 different structures from multiple different viewpoints. So let's start with what differences do we see? Okay, so you can talk out loud. What differences do you see between these structures?
So in the second row, you can see like the stud on top. Some of them are a regular stud, while others are maybe a flat one or a flowering one, I guess.
Okay. Other differences. What other differences? Does anybody else see differences?
Like just in the color mostly.
Color for sure. How about this? So you see this cylinder here instead of a Lego head? Right? Now, can some of these differences be resolved? They're allowed to feel in the bag. They can't look, but they can feel in the bag. Do you think they could resolve whether it's a button, a plate, or a flower? Probably. How about a cylinder versus a head? You can see they're definitely different sizes. So they should be able to figure that out, right? So given enough time, do you think they could be pretty darn sure about the structure? That they've got the structure right? Okay, but color. Is anyone's model better than another with color? Yeah, color's a really hard one, but given more time and maybe more equipment, do you think they could figure out the color? Like one of my students once said, why don't I just put my cell phone in the bag and take a picture? I guess I didn't say you couldn't do that, right? So over time, we might gather more evidence and we might get a little bit more sure about the color. All right, so when we're relating this to the nature of science, this is how theories are built, right? And so with science, all we can do is observe the natural world. We can gather any evidence we can find, but we can't necessarily go back in time. We can't look in the bag. So all we can do is look at the result of what's happened over time, and we can gather that evidence, right? And so we test multiple hypotheses. It's a head, it's a cylinder, or it's a button, or it's a flower. We test these hypotheses, and we come up with a model of the truth. And that model of the truth in scientific terms is called a theory. And so we say, all right, this is our best model of the truth. It's based on all the available evidence we have. Now, if we're talking about the structure of this model, how sure are we of this theory? Say 98%, 99%.
I'd say, yeah, around 99%. We could
Yeah.
be pretty sure.
But there are certain things we're unsure of, like the color. And so if we look, for instance, at the theory of evolution, right? As scientists, the mechanism of evolution, that evolution occurred on Earth, we're like 99% sure we've got it right. But as far as like how particular organisms evolved or what the pressures were that caused certain things, yeah, we're still trying to figure that out. We're still looking for evidence to try to fine tune some of those. But the theory itself is pretty sure. So we have to be careful how we use the word theory, because in like common vernacular, we use the theory like it's a guess, right? But that's not what it means in science. In science, it means we are pretty darn sure. Never 100%, because there's always the possibility that new evidence will come about, but we're pretty darn sure about these theories. Okay, so understanding how science works, how we gather evidence, can help us better understand some of the theories that science has put forth, like the theory of evolution, right? Okay, so let's look at another one. Let's see, where are we? Okay, so let's say, and this is actually true, we've unearthed a woolly mammoth baby. Okay, we've pulled it out of the snow. You can see a little bit of snow here. And it's been preserved well enough that we have its DNA. And so potentially we could splice that DNA into an elephant embryo and birth a woolly mammoth today. Okay, so let's say I'm a company and I'm coming to you for investments. I want investors on this project. I want to birth a woolly mammoth. Well, not me personally. I want to use an elephant to birth a woolly mammoth. Okay, so my question to you is, as investors, what are your questions for me? What kind of questions might you want to ask before you invest?
Well, for starters, I'm pretty sure we've all seen Jurassic Park. They did something pretty similar, and there's always problems. So
yeah, so you might want to know, like, what are the ecological consequences?
Yeah.
Okay. Nolan, what question do you want to ask?
Maybe what the benefits are. Like, how would
Okay.
you profit off of it?
Oh, good. Yeah. What's the profits? Okay. Yeah. Emily, you have a question?
I would want to know how likely it is to work and if it's safe.
Probability of survival, safe for the elephant that's going to be birthing the mammoth,
Yeah.
maybe. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Lizzie?
I'd probably want to know if it's even like ethically okay to do that. Like,
Oh, okay.
to bring back a species that like already was extinct.
Yeah, is it ethical? I'm glad you brought that up. So let's think about the questions we've posed. Is it possible? What are the ecological consequences? Is it safe? How much is it going to cost? What's the profits? which of those questions can be answered by science?
I would say pretty much all of them can be answered except for the ethics one.
Okay, would everybody agree? We could probably make predictions about the ecological consequences. We know cost. We probably can make predictions about probability of safety and likelihood that it'll be successful. But yeah, can we as scientists answer whether or not it's ethical? That's a whole different field, right? And so that's something that often comes up when we learn about science. And it's not just, it's the scientist's fault, it's religionists' fault. It comes from both sides. But the idea that science is somehow atheistic. So when I say atheistic, I mean that somehow it destroys God, right? That God cannot exist if science does. The opposite of that would be what we are. We're theistic, right? We believe that God exists. But science, whether God exists or not, or whether something is ethical or not, those are not questions that science can answer. And so science as a discipline is what we call agnostic. So agnostic means the absence of belief. So going back to evolution, for example, can science tell us whether God was involved in the creation or that God was definitely not involved? Saying God was definitely not involved, there is no God, is just as non-scientific as saying God does exist and was involved. Both of those require faith in something that we don't have scientific evidence for. And so science is strictly agnostic. So anytime you're learning about something in science and it seems to be threatening your belief in God, you need to remember that science can't answer questions like that. That's not what science is trying to tell you. Science is just raw data. This is what the data says. Whether that involves faith or belief in God or not is not a question for science. So keeping in mind that science is agnostic can help you navigate some of these potential conflicts. Okay. All right. Let's look at number 5. This is, I'm going to bring this over here, God of the gaps. Have you heard of God of the gaps? It's probably the most common mistake I see students make, and adults alike. And that is where you place your faith in God on his ability to fill in a gap in your understanding, right? So since science can't explain this, that must be God. Okay. And so that's a very dangerous game to play, because then as science advances and finds explanations for things that maybe were unexplainable before, then what happens to your God? So a classic example is way back in ancient times, we had Zeus, right? And Poseidon and all these gods that explain some of the natural weather patterns and phenomena that were happening on Earth because they didn't understand from a scientific perspective. But once science could explain it, then there was no need for Zeus or Poseidon or any of these gods. And so another example I'm giving you here is whales. So whales are really amazing creatures, right? They live in the water, but they're mammals. So they give live birth, they nurse their young, they breathe air. It's crazy that they live in the water. And so for a long time, it puzzled scientists. And often the explanation would be, well, God just created them exactly that way and dropped them into the water, right? That would be a God of the gaps. Well, since we can't explain how whales got into the water, it must be God. Well, the danger is that as we've gone over the last couple of decades, we've seen all kinds of fossils, and we have this very clear picture of how whales have evolved to live in the water and adapt to the water. So they originally were a 4-legged wolf-like creature, Pakicetus mesonicid, and gradually over time, by exploring different niches, they became a fully aquatic organism. And then we look at today in whales, if you look inside their flippers, they have a full human hand, all the bones of a human hand inside of their flipper. We find vestigial pelvic bones inside of their abdomen, because they used to have hind legs. Even look at this little dolphin embryo, you can see feet, right? As they develop, they actually develop feet, and then they lose those feet. And so this is one where we found the scientific evidence to explain how whales made it into the water. And so if you've based your faith on that fact, then all of a sudden God disappears. And that's where you can get conflict. So you should not believe in God because he can explain unexplainable things. Right? You should believe in God for an entirely different set of reasons, because you've had personal relationships with him. You've had experiences of revelation. You've felt the Spirit. Those kinds of things science can't ever replace, right? Those are different. That's a different kind of evidence than scientific evidence. That's spiritual evidence. And that's where your faith in God should be, rather than, oh, well, I can't explain that, and so I'm just going to say that's God and I'm not going to bother to learn it, right? And so if we keep those separate, the types of evidence that science gives, the types of evidence that religion gives, then they don't come into conflict. Okay, so let's look at number 6. Where are we? Okay, yes. So number 6, this is a fun one. So this is to display dogmatism or discomfort with uncertainty. So way back in the 1600s, when scientists were trying to figure out how chemistry worked, right? They noticed that when you took a log and you burned it, that the ashes were lighter. So something was leaving the log, and they named it phlogiston. Okay, phlogiston was what was coming out of the log as fire, and phlogiston always rises, so it's lighter than air, and then air is lighter than water, and water is lighter than earth. So if you take a piece of earth and you drop it in the water, it should sink to the bottom. If you take a bubble of air and put it down under the water, it should float to the top, right? And if you burn something, phlogiston would rise to the very top. So this was the leading theory in the 1600s. But then in the 1700s, they started doing tests with other metals like magnesium that actually gets heavier when you burn it. And then it was like, oh no. And then Cash, you brought up earlier, well, what about pumice?
Yeah, pumice, it's a rock, it's earth, but if you drop it in water, it floats to the top.
And so this was like blowing their minds, right? New evidence that was coming out. And then eventually they discovered oxygen as the element that's actually responsible for the fire in the log, and that the oxygen was turning into carbon dioxide. It wasn't actually leaving and floating away, that it was just changing form. And they discovered oxidation. And so this whole theory was laid to rest. And so the point is that as science progresses, we learn more things. And so you should never be dogmatic about the fact that right? I know that this is the way that it happened. Well, we're pretty sure, but things could change as we learn more. And so, and the same thing is true on the religious side, right? We can't be dogmatic about our religious faith that, oh, I know this is the case. Maybe. But maybe being more comfortable with not knowing everything right now is important. So let me share with you 2 quotes. This first one here is by Thomas Burnett, and it says, "It is one thing to celebrate science for its achievements and remarkable ability to explain a wide variety of phenomena in the natural world. But to claim there is nothing knowable outside the scope of science could be similar to a successful fisherman saying that whatever he can't catch in his nets does not exist. Once you accept that science is the only source of human knowledge, you have adopted a philosophical position called scientism that cannot be verified or falsified by science itself. It is, in a word, unscientific." And then on the opposite side, I had a student email me and say, "When I was younger, I thought that as a member of the church, we knew everything and had the answers to all questions. It took a refining fire of doubt and learning how to deal with uncertainty in medical school to humble me and teach me the limits of our spiritual knowledge, as well as the limits of our scientific knowledge. I have found that humbly embracing uncertainty while hoping and trusting in a loving Savior and God makes life thrilling and full of wonder." And I think that's something that we often struggle with as members of the church, and that is being okay to not know yet, right? And I think it kind of stems, I've got this little picture here of this little boy bearing his testimony. And I mean, we're encouraged from the time we're like little to get up and be like, I know the church is true. I know the scriptures are true. And I'm looking at it, I'm thinking, you're 5. Do you really know this? Probably not, but it's okay that you don't know that it's true, right? It's be much more appropriate to say, I believe the church is true. I believe the scriptures are true. Or my parents told me that the church is true and I believe them, right? And so being able to sit with uncertainty for a time. So when something comes into conflict, to say, I really don't know. I really don't know how those go together, but I'm going to learn more, either on the science side or the religion side, or both, right? Any thoughts on this? Have you guys encountered this dogmatism, either in science or religion?
I think this goes perfectly along with the Legos, like you were talking about, how this could possibly be that our understanding is hidden inside the bag. And as we continue to learn, it'll be like unveiled. And then like the scripture says that like in the last day, all things will be revealed. It's like in the last day, we will finally know like how all this science that we know and all this religion like go together perfectly, you know?
Yeah. And we just need to be patient. Yeah. Anyone else have experiences with this?
I sort of feel like a lot of the time I felt like this little boy in this picture, just like going up there to bear my testimony, and half the time I'm up there and I have no idea what I'm saying because I just, at the time I didn't know. And, I mean, still even today, like you don't know 100% of anything, and you never really will, but you can always, believe, you can always have that faith. But yeah, like the Lego experiment, like you can only be so sure.
Yeah. And I would say, and I would encourage you that if you do run into uncertainty, choose your faith for now, and then figure out the science later, right? Because they will work together. All truth will work together as one whole eventually. We just have to figure out how. And so try to avoid dogmatism. So the question becomes, can we learn science and maintain faith? And I hope it's a clear, resounding yes, of course. I'm a scientist. I'm a faithful member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I believe in God. It doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. I love this quote from President Nelson. So this was when he dedicated the life sciences building at BYU campus. And he said, "There is no conflict between science and religion. Conflict only arises from an incomplete knowledge of either science or religion or both." And I think he clearly understands that that's the issue, right? We just don't know everything yet. And so we just need to be patient and continue to be faithful and work our way through the science and the religion and know that it is going to come together eventually at some point, right? And so I just wanted to share too. So just to recap, remember the 6 things you should not do, right? Don't assume a deficit. Don't use pseudoscience. Make sure you understand the nature of science. Keep in mind that science is agnostic, not atheistic. Don't set your faith on gaps in our understanding, and make sure you're okay with uncertainty. So the last question is, why does it matter? Why does it matter if you accept evolution? And I'm just going to tell you a little story. So to understand something means that you can regurgitate it on a test, right? That you can use it, whatever. But to accept it means you truly recognize that it is valid and correct, and you're going to use it in your lives. So I'll give you a quick example. This is a little boy that was born because his mother had preeclampsia. So preeclampsia is a condition that arises in a pregnant mom that makes her blood pressure go through the roof, and then they have to deliver the baby, and often the baby is way too young, right? And so it causes all kinds of deaths of babies and mothers every year. And so scientists have been trying to figure out what's going on, like what's wrong with the mother's body that she develops this preeclampsia. Well, there was an evolutionary scientist who was looking at it from an evolutionary standpoint and saying, it's really the baby that's trying to suck more nutrients, which increases the blood pressure. That would make sense. So it's got to be something triggered from the baby that would cause them to get more nutrients. And if the mom's body can temper it, then the baby is bigger and healthier and would survive, right? This is an evolutionary perspective. And this scientist went to the doctors and said, I have this theory, this hypothesis based on evolutionary theory that the signal is coming from the baby, not the mother. The problem is with the baby. And the scientist or the doctor that he talked to, thankfully, didn't just understand evolution, but accepted that this was a viable hypothesis and spent the money and the time and the effort to test this hypothesis. And it turns out they were right. The signal comes from the baby. And so they're now actively working on drugs to fix this condition and save lives. And so I would say for anything in science, like, does it matter? Why don't I just ignore it, right? Put my head in the sand and not learn it? But by knowing it and understanding it and accepting it as valid, you're going to use it in your lives. You're going to better your lives. You're going to better other people's lives. And so I think it's really important that we know and understand and accept evolution and science, all the things you learn in science. So I'll just leave that with you, that I know that these things are compatible. I know that they can come together. I hope you will have patience. I hope that you will stick with your faith, even when things seem to conflict, and just learn more. And I leave that with you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.